All right, folks, welcome back to the channel. Today's video, we're talking about arrow clocking. What is it? Why does it matter? And what you need to know about the way your arrow clocks out of your bow. So first off, what is arrow clocking? This is a term that people refer to as the way that your arrow will want to leave the bow minus not having any fletching. So bare shaft, you shoot the bow, or within 3 to 4 feet of the riser, the arrow is going to start spinning. Is it going to start spinning left? Is it going to start spinning right? That's something that you will have to determine. You just take a bare shaft arrow, nock it, get 3 or 4 feet away from your target, shoot it. You can put a mark on the arrow shaft itself, or you can just look into the target and see which way your nock turned. So if it's a little bit tilted to the left, it wants to come off your bow to the left. If it's a little bit tilted to the right, it wants to go to the right. But there is something that's going to cause the way that arrow is clocking, and that is the way your string is twisted. The way the string is twisted and the way the serving marries it. So 90% of arrows are going to clock left because 90% of the strings on the market are rotated clockwise. So with a clockwise twist in your string, you're going to get an arrow that rotates to the left. Most bows are going to make an arrow clock to the left out of the bow. If you have a counterclockwise string and your serving is rotated counterclockwise, you are going to get a right twist directly out of the bow.
All right, guys, we've been out here all week playing with arrows, doing a bunch of testing. We have high-speed cameras set up, just having our minds blown. But this prime in line 3 right now is set up with a factory string that is twisted clockwise. So it's a clockwise twist, center serving is twisted clockwise, which will always produce a counterclockwise rotation on your arrow. You know, it's something that a lot of guys overlook, and there's a lot of myths around this. You know, some guys believe if you have a right-handed bow, your arrow is going to clock one way. If you have a left-handed bow, it's going to clock one way. Some people talk about the spine or your fletchings. I'm telling you, we've tested this this is the 3rd day. Tested all kinds of different configurations, and it is solely based on the rotation of how your string is twisted in conjunction with your serving. The only other thing that affects it is knock pressure. So right here, we'll shoot this real quick. So this arrow should clock to the left. So cock vane was completely up, and more than likely, we'll show this on high speed, but you had 3/4 of a rotation to the left coming out of this bow. So that is a clockwise twisted string, clocking your arrow counterclockwise, and we're gonna show you Cameron's bow, who is set up opposite to get a clockwise rotation out of your arrow.
So here we have my bow. The only difference between my string and Chad's string is the way, the orientation the string is twisted. So this string is twisted counterclockwise, the serving is twisted counterclockwise, and this is going to be the only way you can get the arrow to rotate to the right consistently, no matter what your vane configuration is. So we'll shoot this here, and you'll see that this wants to clock to the right. Here's cock vane rotating to the right. So you'll see on the high-speed camera, but we messed with this for days upon days trying to figure out why initially our arrows were clocking to the left. So we got new strings this morning. We're now clocking to the right. Excited to see what these things will do. So why does all this stuff matter? Or does it matter at all? We spent the last few weeks really testing this stuff out. We had a high-speed camera and we did a bunch of different tests. And what we found was the biggest consideration you need to make with arrow clocking was matching your helical or fletching or offset on your fletching to the clock of your bow. If you have an arrow that wants to clock to the left naturally, you can put a left offset or a left helical that will marry that clock, and that will have a more efficient arrow downrange. What I mean by that, your arrow is going to want to leave the bow spinning left, and your fletching is going to enhance the spin to the left. It's going to work with the way the arrow wants to naturally clock. One of the concerns with having an arrow that wants to clock to the left, which is why a lot of guys you'll see will still shoot a right helical or a right offset with a arrow that naturally wants to clock to the left. When you thread your field point or your broadhead into the end of the arrow, you are turning it to the right, righty-tighty. If you have an arrow that's spinning to the left and you come into contact with something and that arrow wants to continue to spin to the left and that field point doesn't spin, you're going to end up loosening or unthreading your field point or your broadhead. That's why when you shoot your field points into a target, you have to tighten them almost every time in between shots. You have that rattle, you're like, oh man, my field point is loose. If you are concerned with your field points or broadheads loosening with a left clocking arrow, you can combat that with your fletchings. You can have a right offset or a right helical to make that arrow want to rotate back to the right. But what happens is the arrow will leave the bow naturally to the left and it'll stall out downrange. And once it stalls out, it will come to a point where the arrow recovers and it will then start spinning to the right. It doesn't happen initially. In our testing, we saw this happen between like 15 and 18 yards. So any distance past that, you're fine, you're spinning to the right. But here's what you need to keep in mind. If you're shooting a single bevel broadhead and you're matching the single bevel broadhead to the fletching, right helical, right bevel, left helical, left bevel. If you have an arrow clocking to the left naturally and you offset your fletchings to make that arrow spin back to the right because you're shooting a right beveled broadhead, if you shoot an animal before that arrow starts to correct itself, that bevel on that broadhead is either going to be working against your arrow, or at the moment of impact, the arrow is not going to be spinning at all, which won't add any twist to the arrow. So those are some things to keep in mind. Now, I know that there has to be some loss of energy. If you think about if your arrow is wanting to go to the left, you match that helical and make it spin to the left the entire time, you have to have an energy loss if that arrow needs to correct itself. So if you fletch an arrow that is going to the left, fletch it to make it go to the right, there has to be some type of energy loss when that arrow stalls out and then corrects itself. But in our testing, we found that the point of aim, point of impact, the difference there is really, really, really minimal, and it's hard to even notice. So at the end of the day, does it ever really matter? And I think the biggest consideration comes into play with your broadhead, whether or not you're shooting a single bevel broadhead. If you have an arrow that naturally wants to clock to the left, which 90% of you do because of the way your string is made, it might be best to shoot a left beveled broadhead and a left helical or left offset. Like I said, you do have the threat or the concern of that broadhead and field point unthreading. We don't have any testing necessarily to show that it is going to unthread, but in theory, you thread them into the right. If you have an object wanting to spin to the left, you're going to loosen it in some form or fashion. If you want to shoot a right beveled head with a right helical, even though your bow wants to naturally clock that arrow to the left, are you really going to be losing enough to make a difference? Probably not. So at the end of the day, shoot what makes you happy, shoot what shoots best out of your bow. Don't overthink archery, because a lot of things that we're finding end up not really making that much of a difference at all, and it's more of a headache than you need to worry about. So just know why they want to clock the certain way, and if you fletch the opposite way, just know what's going on there. So that's the idea behind this video. Hope that helped you out. Leave us a thumbs up, comment which way your arrows are clocking and which way you have them fletched and your experiences with this down below, and we'll see you next time.